Chapter 1. The garden party at Haycroft Hillet was a fine breezy afternoon in the village of Haycroft Hill, the kind of May day that inspired strawberry trifle, neatly trimmed hedges, and whispers behind gloved hands. The annual garden party, hosted by Mrs. Georgina Grenfell, was in full bloom, complete with bunting, trestle tables of sponge cake, and a brass quartet wheezing valiantly through Handel. Beneath a white marquee lined with bunting, half the village congregated in celebration of nothing in particular, just the shared satisfaction of another spring survived. Miss Marple, seated comfortably in a wicker chair beneath the shade of a tulip tree, observed the crowd with the calm composure of a woman who had long ago learned that most answers lay not in what people said, but in how they pretended not to say it. She sipped her tea, lukewarm and overstewed, though she made no complaint, and watched Mrs. Grenfell preside over her lawn like a queen in exile. Lady Eastcliff had brought her poodle, which barked at shadows. The Reverend Morley attempted to make polite conversation with Major Penrose, who looked as if he might expire from the effort of being civil. And in the midst of it all was Violet Barton, the new housemaid from Grenfell Hall. Pale as milk and trembling like a leaf, she moved awkwardly through the crowd, offering plates of cucumber sandwiches, her apron slightly askew, her eyes flicking nervously at every sudden sound. Miss Marple noticed her at once. Violet, barely 17, had only been employed at the hall for a fortnight, and already the village had turned its attention to her curious behaviour. Some said she was simple, others said she was foreign. Miss Marple, who believed neither, quietly noted that the girl flinched when addressed, avoided eye contact, and carried herself with the burden of someone walking into a room she'd rather flee. "She's frightened of something," murmured Miss Marple, almost to herself. "Who is, dear?" asked Mrs. Price Ridley, who had taken the seat beside her. "The Grenfells' new housemaid," Miss Marple replied lightly, stirring her tea. "She moves like a creature used to shadows, not sunshine," Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "Nonsense, she's just shy, or possibly stupid. The last one was caught with the gardener. This one seems more the mousy type." Miss Marple smiled gently. Mice rarely tremble unless they've seen a cat. At that moment, a shrill cry rang out across the garden. It came from the west lawn, by the hedgerow near the croquet set. A scuffle of movement followed, and several guests rushed to their feet. Miss Marple did not stand. She merely folded her napkin neatly in her lap and waited for the news to arrive. It did so promptly in the form of Georgina Grenfell herself, flanked by the vicar's wife, and a flushed young man who looked distinctly unhelpful. "She fainted," Mrs. Grenfell said with strained composure. "Right there in the grass, poor thing. Violet. One moment she was collecting teacups and the next, flat as a pancake. I told Edward we shouldn't have pushed her to serve this soon. Some girls just don't take to village life." "Fainted?" said Mrs. Price Ridley, scandalized. "But surely that's not cause for such commotion." Mrs. Grenfell's lips twitched. "She didn't just faint, Beatrice. She screamed, as though she'd seen a ghost, or worse." Miss Marple tilted her head. What exactly was she doing at the time? Handing a saucer to Lady Eastcliff, I believe. And the scream? Blood-curdling. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "Interesting." The crowd soon dispersed again, with whispers as thick as ivy. Violet had been carried indoors by Mrs. Grenfell's cook and laid upon the chaise longue. The doctor had been sent for. No bones broken, only nerves. And yet, as the sun dipped behind the hedges and the party began to thin, Miss Marple rose quietly and wandered over to where the girl had fallen. The grass was damp but firm. Nothing disturbed but a cracked saucer and a single silver teaspoon lying good 4 feet away, glinting oddly in the fading light. Miss Marple bent to retrieve it. At the same moment, she heard a sound behind her, a breath quickly stifled. Turning, she saw the cook, Mrs. Tewkesbury, watching her from the patio steps. Didn't slip, the woman said in a low voice. That scream, Miss Marple, she saw something. Saw? Miss Marple echoed softly. Mrs. Tewkesbury nodded once. Or someone, and I don't think she was meant to. That night the talk in Haycroft Hill turned sharply from jam recipes to speculation. Had the girl simply been overwhelmed? Had she suffered some kind of fit? And why had she flung the saucer as she screamed? No one knew, but Miss Marple, sitting by her bedroom window with a small notepad and an unread Agatha Troy mystery at her elbow, quietly noted 3 things. First, the spoon had no business being that far from the scene, unless it had been flung or snatched. Second, Violet Barton had not screamed like a girl fainting. She had screamed like someone who recognized danger. Third, someone else in that garden had heard it too, and was very quietly, very carefully, pretending they hadn't. Chapter 2. The village reacts. In the little village of Haycroft Hill, news moved faster than any motor car, and more circuitously than the lanes that twisted between the hedgerows. By mid-morning the day after the garden party, every household from Havishire, Lower Thatch Lane to St. Agnes Road knew that Violet Barton had screamed, properly screamed, before crumpling to the grass with a smashed saucer at her side. Miss Marple, sipping her tea in the corner of the High Street tea-room, noted with interest the swirl of gossip that rolled from table to table like a breeze through tall wheat. "Well, I said at the time," declared Mrs. Price Ridley, loud enough for the entire tea-room to hear. She looked pale as curdled milk. "Timid girls always make me nervous. The fainting sort is often hiding something." "Quite," chimed Miss Letitia Blackthorne, peering over her spectacles. "My theory is she's run away from something, or someone. London girls often do." Miss Marple didn't interrupt. She never needed to. The village would speak its truth and its contradictions in time. Her role was simply to listen, closely. A few minutes later, Miss Hargreaves from the library entered in a flutter, clutching her hat as though she'd just come from a cyclone rather than the post office. "They say she's staying in her room now," she said breathlessly, "and that Mrs. Grenfell won't hear of letting her go, not until she's better. Though between you and me," she added, lowering her voice for effect, "there's more to this than a fainting fit." "Oh?" said Mrs. Price Ridley with relish. "She's been having nightmares, screaming in the night. Poor Mrs. Tewkesbury. Says the girl woke the whole house." There was a communal gasp. "I dare say," Miss Marple murmured gently. "That's not entirely unexpected. Nightmares are often the mind's way of hiding something it already knows." Heads turned toward her, even in Haycroft Hill, where she was affectionately dismissed by some as dear old Miss Marple. There was an instinct to pause when she spoke like that. Miss Blackthorne narrowed her eyes. "Do you know something, Jane?" "Oh, no," said Miss Marple, stirring her tea. "But I imagine someone does. Violet Barton's been in that house a fortnight, and no one's asked where she came from." "She said Cheltenham," sniffed Mrs. Price Ridley. "Did she? Or did someone say it for her?" Miss Marple replied mildly. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took her usual walk past Grenfell Hall. The gate was shut, the garden quieter than usual. No laughter or garden tools clinking, no gossiping maids hanging linens from the line. As she passed by the stone wall that lined the west side of the garden, the very area near the croquet lawn where Violet had collapsed, she paused. Something about the hedge line caught her eye, a shallow impression in the soil, freshly disturbed just beneath the window of the west drawing-room. She leaned a little closer. Footprints. One set, small and neat. The other, heavier, deeper at the heel. Male, judging by the shape. The marks led to the hedge, and then disappeared through the opening in the fence that led down towards the wooded footpath. It would have been quite easy, Miss Marple thought, for someone to slip in or out without being seen, especially during the lively distraction of a party. Interesting. The Reverend Morley paid her a visit that evening, bringing with him the latest church bulletin and a concerned expression. "Miss Marple," he began gently, "I know you've taken an interest in this matter with Violet Barton." "Indeed I have," she said, setting aside her needlework. "It concerns me, Vicar. There's fear in that girl's eyes that didn't come from heat-stroke or overwork." Reverend Morley sighed. "Mrs. Grenfell insists it's nerves. She told me Violet is from respectable stock, but orphaned. Came, recommended from some charitable house. But I must say, the girl, she flinches. And this morning she told my wife someone had been in her room last night." Miss Marple sat forward slightly. "And was anything missing?" "No. But she insisted. Someone had opened her wardrobe and stood at the end of the bed." "Perhaps it wasn't imagination," Miss Marple murmured. "Perhaps it was memory." The Reverend blinked. "You believe she knows whoever frightened her?" "I believe," said Miss Marple gently, "that Violet Barton saw someone at the party she had believed long gone, perhaps even dead, and that person knows she recognized them." There was a long silence. "I think we're no longer dealing with gossip," she finished softly. "We're dealing with danger." That night Miss Marple retrieved a well-thumbed notebook from her side drawer. It contained no official records, only her own observations. She added a new page titled Violet Barton, and wrote beneath it, "Servant of Mrs. Grenfell. 2 weeks trembling, pale, visibly startled by someone at garden party. Fainted after screaming, not before woke household twice this week, from nightmare's footprints by west garden window. Second pair likely male window, beneath which she fainted. Is your ass west drawing room and in bold beneath all, what if the past didn't stay dead?" Chapter 3. The First Clues. Miss Marple had always believed that the smallest gestures, the turn of a hand, the pause before a reply, spoke volumes. But Haycroft Hill, with all its rose-trimmed gardens and dainty teacups, was not a place fond of revelations. Here people concealed things in smiles and folded linens. And as she made her way through the village, The morning after her conversation with Reverend Morley, she knew that whatever truth Violet Barton held had yet to fully emerge from its hiding place. Miss Marple's first visit that day was to Grenfell Hall, not by invitation, but under the pretext of returning a borrowed book. Mrs. Grenfell, appearing at the door with her usual air of distracted refinement, accepted the copy of Mrs. Dalloway with a tight-lipped smile. "Oh, how kind of you to bring it back, Miss Marple," she said. "I must confess I never quite took to Wolfe. A bit murky for my tastes." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Indeed, some minds are like ponds, still on the surface, but quite deep when stepped into." Mrs. Grenfell's smile thinned just slightly. They exchanged pleasantries for another moment before Miss Marple asked, in her most unassuming tone, "And how is poor Violet?" The hesitation was fleeting, but there. "Oh, recovering. Still, a bit shaken, poor girl. I don't believe she was quite prepared for village life. I understand she's had some trouble sleeping. Another flicker, like a shutter in a high wind. Yes, well, the young are sensitive, aren't they? Easily startled. She's been confined to her room since the fainting. Dr. Wallace says it's best she rest." "How wise," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "And is the window in her room secure now? I heard something about it being left open one night." Mrs. Grenfell paused. "Cook must have mentioned that. I'm afraid she's always prone to exaggeration. The window was probably ajar. Violet is fond of night air, I think." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, "as are cats and burglars." Mrs. Grenfell laughed a little too quickly, then shifted the conversation to church flowers. Miss Marple didn't press. She never did, not yet. But as she left Grenfell Hall, she noted that the front parlour curtains had been replaced. Not new, just freshly hemmed. And the grass where Violet had fallen was now meticulously raked, though the rest of the lawn was untouched. Someone had wanted to erase something. Later that afternoon, as she passed the vicarage, Mrs. Morley called to her from the garden gate, "Jane, just the person. Would you care to come in for a slice of seed cake?" Miss Marple, who never declined seed cake from a vicar's wife, accepted at once. They settled in the drawing-room, the gentle afternoon sun spilling across the tea service, and a few early blooms set on the mantel. "I understand Violet's taken quite a liking to embroidery," Miss Marple said, helping herself to a small slice. "She has," Mrs. Morley said with a nod. "She's quiet, very careful with her work. But, oh, I hesitate to say it, but I believe she's terrified of being touched." "Touched?" Mrs. Morley set down her teacup. "I reached to adjust her collar the other day. She flinched as if I'd struck her. And later I found her examining a bruise on her wrist when she thought I wasn't looking." "Did she say anything about it?" "She said she bumped it on the door frame," Mrs. Morley said quietly. "But I've seen girls in London with bruises just like it. It's not a door frame that leaves that mark." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "She's hiding from someone," she said. "The question is whether that someone followed her, or was already here." As the evening drew in, Miss Marple returned to her own cottage, where a letter was waiting in the post-box. It bore no return address, and had been hand-delivered, judging by the absence of a postmark. She opened it with care. Inside was a single scrap of paper, typed, "You'd do best to stop asking questions. Let the girl forget. Let it rest. No signature. no clue as to its source. But the edges were smudged, as though the writer had been in haste or fear, or both. Miss Marple held the paper near the light. It had been typed on a machine with a misaligned R, just slightly above the line. Not many typewriters in the village, fewer still in regular use. She placed the note beside her notebook, where the name Violet Barton was now underlined, twice. The next day brought rain, soft and persistent, the kind that made windows blur and dampen the gossip. Miss Marple used the excuse of returning an umbrella to Mrs. Tewkesbury to pay a second visit to the hall. The cook, tired and flustered, met her at the back entrance. "She's worse, Miss Marple. The girl hardly eats, hardly speaks. Last night she tried to leave, had a bag packed and everything. What stopped her?" "She saw someone," said the cook, her voice low. "Out in the garden, staring up at her window. I swear on my life, Miss Marple, someone was out there." "And did you see them?" "No, but I heard the gate creak open after midnight, and I found boot prints, just one pair, deep in the mud." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And did Violet say anything?" "Only one thing. She said, 'He's come back, but he's not dead.'" Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a fire, opened her notebook once more, and added a fresh line. "Someone Violet thought dead has returned, and they don't intend to be found." She leaned back in her chair and closed, her eyes for a moment as though conjuring the pieces together. Then she opened her eyes, sharp and certain. The game was no longer about what Violet had seen, it was about who had seen her. Chapter 4. The Gathering Storm. By the time Friday arrived, the rain had not relented. It streaked the windows of Haycroft Hill in silvery lines, pooling between cobblestones and dampening even the most stubborn of village gossip. But beneath the surface, the tension that had begun with Violet Barton's scream now curled through the town like fog, thin, heavy, inescapable. Miss Marple spent the morning at her writing desk, examining the anonymous note once more. The misaligned R was a peculiar detail. Such things were rarely noticed by the person typing, but often betrayed a well-used machine. There were 3 known typewriters in the village, one at the vicarage, a battered royal that hadn't worked since Easter, the second at the post office, strictly used for telegrams, and the third kept behind the counter at Linton's General Store by Miss Clara Linton herself. Clara, a woman with suspiciously precise fingernails and an interest in other people's business that rivaled the postmaster's, rarely typed anything beyond invoices, but she was also fond of offering favours. Quiet ones, in brown envelopes, sealed with far more than glue. At 10 o'clock sharp, Miss Marple set off through the rain with a borrowed hat-pin, a canvas bag of stale scones for the birds, and an ancient, entirely unrelated question to pose. "Miss Linton," she said cheerfully as she stepped into the shop, "how clever of you to always know who needs what before they ask. I do wonder, how do you keep track of it all?" Clara beamed. "Type it all up, Miss Marple, in my ledger. Got the typewriter from my uncle's office after the war. Still works a treat." "Ah, your uncle, the solicitor? How very practical." She waited until Clara turned away to wrap someone's change, then glanced quickly behind the counter. The typewriter sat there, covered by a white tea towel, the edge of the paper feed still smudged faintly with black. On her way out, Miss Marple dropped the scone bag beneath the postbox. By the time she'd returned home, she had little doubt that Clara Linton either knew something or knew someone who did. Meanwhile, Violet remained shuttered away in her upstairs room at Grenfell Hall, though Mrs. Grenfell insisted to all who asked that she was resting nicely. Miss Marple, however, had learned from Mrs. Tewkesbury that Violet had taken to sleeping in the armchair by the window, her bag still half packed by the wardrobe. Twice she'd asked whether the door locked from the inside. "She's like a bird that hears the hawk," the cook had murmured. "Doesn't make a sound, but you can feel the panic in her bones." Miss Marple understood the feeling well. That evening, she visited Inspector Cray at the county station, a man she had known since his first year on the force, when he'd failed to solve the curious case of the stolen ring hidden in a plum pudding. "This is not yet a crime," Cray said cautiously as she laid out her facts, "but it's very nearly something." Miss Marple simply nodded. "Have you got a name?" he asked her. "Not yet," she said, "but I've got a face I haven't seen, and footprints that don't belong to any man we know." Cray drummed his fingers on the desk. "You think she saw someone at the party? Someone who wasn't supposed to be there?" "I think she saw a ghost," Miss Marple said, "but a ghost with very real boots." The next morning, another strange event occurred. Lady Eastcliffe's poodle, an odious creature named Muffin with a sharp bark and sharper teeth, had escaped from its lead while being walked past Grenfell Hall. It bolted through the garden gate and began yapping madly at the base of the old tool shed behind the rose trellis. It took 2 gardeners and a very cross Lady Eastcliff to drag the dog away, and even then it continued to snarl in the direction of the locked shed long after it had been leashed. Miss Marple, naturally, heard of this by mid-afternoon. She strolled past the garden herself later that day under the pretext of inspecting a supposedly rare variety of orchid Mrs. Grenfell had once boasted about. The tool shed, long sealed, rarely used, had no sign of forced entry. But the ground beside it, despite the recent rain, showed 2 distinct depressions, one large enough for boots and the other lighter, perhaps from slippers or bare feet. They led to the back entrance of the house. The trail vanished in the grass, but Miss Marple had seen enough. That evening, Violet asked to speak to her. Mrs. Tewkesbury arrived just after supper, soaked and breathless. "She won't talk to the doctor, won't talk to Mrs. Grenfell, but she says if you come, she'll explain everything. She's too frightened to sleep again." Miss Marple arrived at Grenfell Hall just before nightfall. Violet sat curled in a blanket at the foot of her bed, her hair loose, her cheeks pale but dry. "He's been in the house," she whispered. "Who, dear? I don't know his name. He said to call him Mr. Crane, but he's not. He's the man from the cliffs, the man who died." Miss Marple leaned forward gently. "You saw him at the party?" Violet nodded. "He was by the hedge. He looked right at me. Then he smiled, the way he used to, the way he did before he said he was going to disappear. Was he alone? Don't know, but someone let him in that night. I heard a knock. I heard steps outside my door, and I found one of the garden keys missing the next morning." Miss Marple sat quietly. Violet's voice trembled. "He said if I told anyone, he'd make me disappear too, like I never existed." There was a long silence. Then Miss Marple said very softly, "He shouldn't have come back, dear. And he shouldn't have chosen Haycroft Hill. You see, People forget how carefully this village watches its shadows. That night in her cottage, Miss Marple wrote 4 names in her notebook. She circled 2, and beneath them, a final line, the living. Man wore the dead man's smile, and someone here is helping him hide. Chapter 5. A Man Called Crane. The next morning brought with it no sunshine, only a thin pearl-grey mist that clung to the fields and hedgerows like a shroud. Miss Marple rose early, her mind already in motion before the kettle had boiled. She dressed with particular care, her good brooch, the one with the tiny forget-me-nots, and her sturdy walking shoes, and by 8:30 she was already on the lane to Linton's general store. Clara Linton was behind the counter, counting a tray of halfpennies with the nervous precision of someone rehearsing her innocence. "Good morning, Clara," Miss Marple greeted cheerfully. "Morning, Miss Marple. Lovely weather for ducks." "Indeed," she said, her tone light. "I was hoping you might help me with something. You keep your records so neatly. I wondered if you recalled any recent orders placed under the name Crane." Clara's hand froze above the change tray. "Crane?" she echoed. "Don't believe so. Doesn't sound familiar." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh, that's quite odd. I'm nearly certain I overheard someone say they'd seen a Mr. Crane about town. Very tall, rather intense eyes. Thought perhaps he might have placed an order. Some flour, perhaps? Tea?" Clara looked flustered. "We don't take names unless it's for deliveries, and there haven't been any new ones." Miss Marple smiled. "Of course. I only ask because Violet Barton said she heard the name whispered at the back gate of Grenfell Hall, the very night someone tried to climb in through the garden window." That did it. Clara's colour rose like a tide. I wouldn't know anything about that." She stammered. "I've just been minding the shop." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "But you've minded other things before. I recall you once helped Mr. Draper type a rather private letter. Something about a cousin in debt." Clara's lips tightened. "She said he was her brother," Clara muttered, "when he first came to the shop. Told me not to mention he was in Haycroft Hill. Said it was only temporary." "Who did?" "The girl, Violet. She came in one evening and asked to use the phone. Said her brother was coming to fetch her. But when he arrived, he made her cry, right outside." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Did you happen to overhear anything else?" Or hesitated. "He said he'd made it look real, and she wasn't going to ruin that now." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Made what look real?" But Clara only shook her head. "I don't know." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Dr. Wallace, the village's stoic physician, whose manner often resembled that of a grandfather clock. Slow, deliberate, and reliable. She inquired gently about the injuries Violet had suffered. "Doctor," Wallace was cautious but not dismissive. "She has bruises," he said, "consistent with restraint, wrist, upper arm, and one rib, possibly cracked. She claims to have slipped on the stairs." "But you don't believe her." "I believe she's afraid to tell the truth, which is often more dangerous than fear itself." He glanced at her. "I know you're not here for idle chatter, Jane. What is it you're really asking me?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Do you believe she's in danger from someone presently in the village?" A long pause. "I believe someone followed her here," he said at last. and I believe they're biding their time." Later, as dusk settled like gauze over the village, Miss Marple stood at her garden gate, peering toward the road that led to the woods behind Grenfell Hall. She had no proof yet, no names that would stand up in court. But there was one place she hadn't yet explored: the tool shed, that forgotten building tucked into the edge of Mrs. Grenfell's rose garden, shut for years until the scream. And so, shortly after dark, with her shawl wrapped tightly and a lantern in hand, Miss Marple returned to the rear path behind Grenfell Hall. She moved with quiet confidence, taking the long way round, past the willow tree, then down the gravel trail where few ever walked. So, Toolshed stood in silence. The door was shut, but not locked. Inside, the air smelled of oil and earth. An old spade leaned in the corner, a broken rake, and a canvas roll of tools, clean and well kept, too well kept for something abandoned. And next to them, a travel case. Stained, brown leather, monogrammed, MF. She opened it carefully. Inside were men's clothes, a shaving kit, a passport, face down. She turned it over. Matthew Felton. She knew the name at once, from the newspaper clipping Dr. Lennox had sent. The man presumed dead at Weybourne Cliffs. A fall. No body found. Open verdict. And here he was. Alive. Hidden in Haycroft Hill. And not hiding alone. She returned home in silence. In her notebook, she wrote just one name: Matthew Felton, alias Mr. Crane, alive, in Haycroft Hill, possibly residing with help. Motive unclear. Violet knows, and he knows. She knows. She circled it, underlined it, then turned the page. And at the top of the next, she wrote, "Who is helping him?" Chapter 6. Shadows. Behind the lace by. Sunday morning, the rain had softened to mist. Haycroft Hill wore it like a veil, trailing through the hedges and hanging in droplets from the eaves of thatched roofs. Inside the church, hymns echoed gently, beneath the old beams, but Miss Marple's thoughts were far from the choir stalls. She sat quietly in her pew, gloved hands resting on her lap, observing rather than praying. Mrs. Grenfell was 2 rows ahead, pale and stiff, her neck rising above, her lace collar like a column of frost. Clara Linton sat with her sister across the aisle, unusually subdued, her normally darting eyes fixed blankly ahead. And in the very back, standing half in shadow, was a tall man Miss Marple had not seen before. Broad-shouldered, hat removed, but his expression hidden by the lowered angle of his chin. When the final hymn ended, and the parishioners filed out with murmurs of lovely sermon, and such a pity about the weather, Miss Marple lingered a little longer than most. Outside, she caught a brief glimpse of the man stepping into the lane behind the vicarage, just before he vanished into the trees. She turned and almost collided with Mrs. Grenfell. "My dear Miss Marple, you're looking awfully serious," Georgina said with a brittle laugh. "Don't tell me the sermon was that dire?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, no, quite the contrary. But I did wonder whether you happened to notice the tall gentleman near the rear pew." Mrs. Grenfell's eyes fluttered, just a flicker. "No, one of consequence. A distant cousin, I believe, passing through. Why do you ask?" "I've always found strangers in a small parish particularly interesting," Miss Marple replied gently. "They so rarely are." That afternoon, Violet Barton did not come down for her embroidery lesson at the vicarage. Mrs. Morley, concerned, sent a note to Grenfell Hall, only to receive a reply from cook stating that Violet was unwell again, and not to be disturbed. Miss Marple heard of this by tea-time. By dusk, she had called upon Dr. Wallace once more. "She has marks around her wrists again," he confirmed quietly. "Older bruises fading, newer ones forming. And she refuses to say." "She's frightened," the doctor replied. "More than I think I've seen anyone frightened. She said something last night that chilled me." Miss Marple looked up. She said, "If I tell the truth, someone else will die." The next morning brought a sudden burst of movement. Inspector Cray arrived in the village just before 9, summoned at last by the collection of quiet evidence. Miss Marple had laid before him. They met in her parlour, where she laid out the facts like cards. "1," she began, "Matthew Felton was presumed dead, but has been living under the name Mr. Crane. I've found his belongings in the tool shed at Grenfell Hall. 2, Violet Barton knew him, likely from before. Possibly a relationship of some kind, but not a happy one. 3, someone is aiding him, feeding him, housing him. And I believe it's Mrs. Grenfell." Cray looked up sharply. "The lady of the house? Georgina is many things," Miss Marple said mildly. "Snobbish, proud, obsessed with appearances, but not easily manipulated. Which means she's not being fooled. She's helping him, deliberately." Cray considered that. "But why?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "I think she believes she owes him something, or perhaps that he has something on her." By midday, a quiet search of Grenfell Hall was under way. Cray, with 2 plainclothes constables, questioned the staff gently. Mrs. Tewkesbury feigned ignorance, but when pressed, she revealed that Mrs. Grenfell had begun locking the tool shed herself 3 weeks earlier, and kept the only key on a ring beside her writing desk. "Never asked why," she said. "Didn't seem my place." Down in the shed, they found fresh bread, a wool blanket, and a half-burned letter in the stove. The only words left legible: "I told you the past wouldn't stay buried." It was enough. Cray returned to Grenfell Hall just after sunset. Miss Marple went with him. Mrs. Grenfell was in the parlour, a lace handkerchief folded in her lap, eyes rimmed with fatigue but still sharp. "I'm not a fool," she said when confronted. "I knew who he was. He came to me 2 weeks ago, said he had no one else. He begged." "Why not tell the police?" Cray asked. "He said Violet would accuse him of things that weren't true, that he'd been hounded in his last village, that she was unstable. Do you believe him?" Mrs. Grenfell's voice faltered. "I did." Miss Marple spoke gently. "And now?" There was a long pause. "I saw her face, Miss Marple, when she screamed. I see it still. That's not a girl inventing fear. That's a girl who remembers something terrible." Cray nodded once. "We'll need to speak with him. Where is he?" Mrs. Grenfell hesitated. "He left last night. Said it wasn't safe to stay. Did he say where he was going?" She looked down. "No, but he took the garden key." At that, Cray departed for the station to organise a manhunt. But Miss Marple lingered. She watched the fading light drift across the parlour and said quietly, "He'll be back." Mrs. Grenfell looked up, startled. "What makes you so sure?" because men like Matthew Felton don't vanish until they've made certain no one can tell their story, and Violet Barton still can. That night Miss Marple sat beside her window long after the oil lamp had burned low. Outside the mists curled again, thicker now. A dog barked once, then fell silent, and somewhere, not far from Grenfell Hall, someone was waiting for the dark to deepen. Chapter 7. A Knock at the Window. The fog was so thick by midnight that it swallowed the village lamps in a haze of white and turned familiar hedgerows into hulking silhouettes. The streets of Haycroft Hill, so often full of early risers and tidy chatter, were now hushed beneath mist and moonlight. But inside the modest, warm-lit vicarage, sleep had not yet found its way to Violet Barton. She sat curled in the small chair beside the hearth, a thin wool blanket draped around her shoulders. Her suitcase remained by the door, the straps buckled tight. The house was quiet, the fire long reduced to embers, and yet she made no move toward the bed. She was waiting. Outside the window, an owl called once and then again. Then came a sound that did not belong. Tap just once, barely audible tap again. She did not move, but her eyes, wide and dark, stared at the window as though willing it to dissolve. And then tap, tap, scratch, the faintest scraping at the glass. Not forceful, just deliberate. She pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a cry, rose from her chair on trembling legs, and reached for the lamp. But before she could light it, a voice just beyond the pane, "Violet, let me in!" She backed away. The voice came again, muffled and urgent. "It's cold, I'm wet. You know I didn't mean to hurt you." It was him, Matthew. "We've come to make things right," he whispered. The doorknob rattled, then came the creak of a boot on the porch boards. She froze, hands clenched, and whispered, "Please go," but the knob kept turning, and that was when the latch above slid sharply into place, not by her hand, by Miss Marple's. The sitting-room curtain drew back to reveal the slight, firm figure of Jane Marple, shawl draped neatly about her shoulders, and a small coal poker gripped like a sceptre. "I wouldn't try the door again, Mr. Felton," she called out through the glass. "I may look like an old lady, but I once disarmed a man with worse manners than you, and a much sharper knife." A pause. Then, "Who are you?" "Someone Violet trusts. You don't know what she's done." "I think I do," Miss Marple said, voice calm. "I think she ran. I think she escaped, and I think you very much want to ensure she stays silent." Another pause. Then the silhouette at the window disappeared. Violet began to cry. Miss Marple crossed the room and took her hand. "It's all right now, dear," she said softly. "He won't get in tonight." Inspector Cray arrived within 15 minutes, summoned by Mrs. Morley, who had woken to the sound of footsteps and found Violet in tears at the hearth. By the time he arrived, the garden path bore the muddy prints of a man's boots, leading from the hedge to the side entrance and vanishing again into the trees beyond. A careful search turned up no sign of Matthew Felton, but a discarded handkerchief and a half-full flask of whisky were found near the back orchard wall. "He'll have slipped into the woods," Cray muttered. "Knows the area too well, and now he knows we're watching." Miss Marple stood beside him, hands folded. "He won't run far," she said. "He's too proud for that." Cray looked at her. What makes you so sure?" "Because if he were a man who simply wanted to disappear, he'd have done it properly years ago. But he came back, and that tells me he still wants something." Cray frowned. "And what's that?" "To be believed," she said, "or at the very least, to control who tells the story." The following day, Haycroft Hill was buzzing again, quietly but persistently. The story was already weaving itself. Violet attacked in the night, a prowler at the vicarage, police in the orchard with lanterns. Everyone had a version. Few had the truth. At Grenfell Hall, Mrs. Grenfell stayed in her rooms. At the post office, Clara Linton refused to comment, but was seen burning several old receipts in her backyard incinerator. Only Miss Marple moved through the village as though nothing were amiss, pausing for scones at the bakery and nodding at the vicar's wife with perfect grace. But her mind was racing. That evening, she returned to the tool shed, this time alone. She had one more suspicion to test, there, hidden behind the canvas sack, where the tools had been stored. She found a second satchel, old, weathered. Inside it, another passport, false but convincing, cash in 3 currencies, and a page torn from a diary. The writing was Violet's. He said he had nowhere to go, that I owed him, that he made me safe once, and now it was his turn. I didn't believe it then. I don't believe it now. But he said if I told anyone, there'd be another accident, like the first time. Miss Marple folded the page, tucked it into her coat, and stepped out into the chill night air. That evening, she wrote a single line at the bottom of her notebook. She didn't just see him return. She watched him disappear, the first time. Then she crossed out victim beside Violet Barton's name, and wrote witness. Chapter 8. Secrets in the Ashes. Haycroft Hill woke to a golden morning the following day. The fog finally lifted. The sky scrubbed clean as though nature had taken a deep breath. But beneath the fresh light and freshly swept doorsteps, the atmosphere remained taut. A sense of things left unsaid pressed against the village like a held breath. Miss Marple, up before the birds, read over Violet's torn diary page once more. Like the first time, the girl had written. The first time. It was not merely the return of Matthew Felton that had shaken her. It was his past, and what they both knew of it, that made Violet tremble in the dark. Miss Marple sipped her tea and stared into the garden, where a blackbird flitted among the hedges. If Violet had witnessed something years ago, something buried deep enough to fake a death, then that something was the key to everything. And that meant someone else, besides Felton, was still hiding the truth. At 9:30, Miss Marple called upon Reverend Morley under the pretence of discussing Sunday's flower arrangements. The vicar, whose shrewd eyes often belied his gentle sermons, welcomed her into his study. "I imagine this isn't about lilies," he said, gesturing toward the chair by the hearth. "No, Reverend," Miss Marple replied. "It's about Violet Barton." The vicar folded his hands. "She hasn't spoken to me in detail," he said, "but I believe she's caught in something much older than this village, something she carried with her." Miss Marple nodded. "I believe so too. But the tragedy, I think, happened long before she screamed at the garden party." She paused. "Do you remember a housemaid named Celia Pike?" The Reverend blinked. "My word, that's a name I haven't heard in years. Worked for the Pelhams, didn't she?" poor girl died in that fire in Eastbourne." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Supposedly. You think that's connected?" "I think it might be," she said softly. "Violet Barton was placed into service shortly after. No family, no past, no records, only references from a now-closed institution. And the Pelhams moved abroad shortly thereafter." The vicar sat back slowly. "You're suggesting Violet was Celia Pike?" Miss Marple gave the barest nod. "Not by choice, I think. Someone helped bury Celia's past. Perhaps to protect her. Perhaps to protect themselves." Later that day, Miss Marple visited Dr. Wallace again. She showed him the page from the diary, and then carefully posed a question. "Doctor, do you recall the inquest at Weybourne Cliffs? The one about the missing man, Felton?" Wallace nodded. "Of course. No body ever recovered. Rather sloppy police work, I thought. And do you recall the accident that occurred just before it? A house fire in Eastbourne. A young woman reportedly perished." Wallace frowned. "I do recall. Only ashes found. Identification based on a locket, I believe." "A locket," Miss Marple echoed, "can be moved from one neck to another." By sunset, she had a full picture in her mind. Matthew Felton had staged his death once before. But it had not simply been an escape, it had been a cover. Something had happened in that house years ago. A fire, a death, or perhaps a murder. And Violet, then Celia, had seen it. Not only seen it, survived it. That night, Miss Marple went again to Grenfell Hall. She requested an audience with Mrs. Grenfell, who appeared at the parlour door, dressed in a silk wrap, and guarded civility. "I understand," Miss Marple said gently, "that you've known Mr. Felton for longer than you admit." Mrs. Grenfell said nothing. Miss Marple continued, "I believe he worked for your family, that when the fire occurred in Eastbourne, he was involved. Perhaps not as the one who struck the match, but as the one who cleaned it up." Georgina's eyes didn't blink. "You helped him fake his death. You moved him to the continent. You paid for the passport, perhaps through your solicitor. You told no one." A long pause. Then, "It was to protect my husband," Mrs. Grenfell said. Miss Marple didn't react. "He was involved," Georgina said, voice low. "Not in murder, but in foolishness, gambling, debts. He confided in Felton. And when that fire happened, Felton saw an opportunity. If he vanished, so too would the trail." "And Violet?" Miss Marple asked. She knew too much. He was cruel. To her. Frightened her. "I thought, if he stayed gone, she could rebuild." Miss Marple folded her hands. "But ghosts don't stay buried." "No," Mrs. Grenfell whispered. "They don't." That evening, the constables returned to the orchard. Miss Marple led them to the tool shed, where she had replaced the satchel exactly as she had found it. As expected, it was gone. Felton had returned for it, and in his haste left behind a second set of footprints, fresh, leading toward the south woods. The net was closing. Miss Marple said nothing more that evening. She returned home, turned back, the lamp, and finally opened a drawer that she'd kept closed since the garden party. Inside was the silver teaspoon Violet had dropped when she fainted. It had been cleaned, carefully, but along the narrow edge of the handle she'd found a single faint fingerprint, pressed deep enough to leave an impression as if someone had tried to snatch it from her hand. That print, she now realized, belonged to someone with an old burn on his palm, someone whose hand had been marked years ago in the fire at Eastbourne. Miss Marple closed the drawer. She did not need to see the fingerprint again. She already knew to whom it belonged. Chapter 9. The Trap Laid Quietly. The next morning dawned with a chill in the air, unseasonably sharp for spring. Miss Marple took her tea earlier than usual and wrote a brief note in her fine, looping script. She folded it, placed it in an unmarked envelope, and addressed it simply. To be delivered into the hands of Mr. Crane-Wiggins, the vicar's errand boy stood at the doorstep, his face still sleep-warm and his jacket misbuttoned. "Take this to Miss Linton at the shop," she said. "Tell her it's from me. She'll know what to do with it." The boy frowned. "Is it urgent, miss?" Miss Marple looked at him with a faint smile. "Only if read in the wrong hands." At the same time, Inspector Cray had returned from the county border empty-handed. There had been no sign of Matthew Felton's passage by train or road, no hired cars, no unusual travellers. "Still here?" Cray muttered in Miss Marple's parlour. "Or he's walking through the hedgerows like a fox." Miss Marple, meanwhile, stirred her tea with uncharacteristic firmness. "He won't leave," she said. "He still believes he can twist Violet back under his control. He's not running, not yet. He's waiting." Cray glanced up. Waiting? For what? For the story to end his way. Miss Marple placed her spoon on the saucer and looked up. "That's why we must change the ending." By mid-afternoon, Clara Linton had passed the note to a tall man who entered the shop wearing a cap too low for the season, and purchased nothing but a packet of barley sugar. She said nothing when she handed it over. Felton took it without a word, glanced at the script, and left the shop without a backward look. The trap was simple. The note, written in Miss Marple's hand, contained only the following. "She remembers everything. She's told me, tonight. 1 hour after Vespers. Back garden. No one else will be there. Come quietly." The implication was clear. Violet would meet him alone. He would come. She was certain of it, because men like Felton thrived on control, and nothing unsettled them more than knowing someone else now held the thread to the past. That evening, just as the sky shifted from lavender to ash, Miss Marple took a slow walk to the vicarage. The police had already been stationed discreetly. 2 plainclothes constables posted in the garden behind the trees. Cray himself, waiting near the conservatory with another man dressed as a groundskeeper. Violet sat in the kitchen, pale but composed, hands wrapped around a cup of untouched tea. "You're quite certain," she asked Miss Marple, "that this will work?" Miss Marple nodded, calm as a sleeping cat. "He's already read the note. If I know his sort, he'll come half an hour early. Men like him always do. They like to believe they're ahead." She paused. "And when he comes, you mustn't speak to him. Let him talk. Let him say what he came to say. That will be enough." Violet looked down at her hands. "What if I freeze? Then we will catch him in the silence." At precisely 8 minutes past 8, a figure emerged from the hedgerow behind the vicarage garden. He wore no coat. His shirt was open at the throat. His boots, mud-caked, left faint prints in the grass. His eyes moved like a predator's, sweeping the space between trees, shrubs, and benches. No one met him. The garden was still. He stepped toward the rear of the house, where a single lamp lit the corner of the kitchen window. And there she stood, Violet, alone. He moved forward. "Violet," he said. His voice had dropped to a pleading tone. "You shouldn't have spoken to her. You know what she's doing, don't you? She's using you." No reply. "I didn't mean to frighten you. Not really. You left me no choice." Still silence. "She would have ruined us both. That fire. It wasn't me, not entirely. I helped you. I kept you safe. You owe me for that." He was closer now, arms out slightly, palms open. "I only came back to make sure you'd stay quiet. I would have left, Violet, I would have left." And then came the final line. "But now I have to know how much you said, what she knows, and if I need to undo it." That was enough. Inspector Cray stepped from behind the hedge with 2 constables. "Matthew Felton," he said sharply, "you are under arrest for the attempted coercion of Violet Barton, and under investigation for fraud and obstruction of justice relating to your disappearance." Felton froze, mouth half open. Then he turned on Violet, not with rage, but with a look of genuine disbelief. "You brought them?" She met his gaze at last, and her voice was steady. "No," she said. "She did." Miss Marple emerged from the path behind the conservatory, her steps unhurried, her eyes unreadable. Felton looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You," he spat. "You meddled." Miss Marple's tone was cool and unmistakably final. "I listened," she said. "It's what people never expect." By 9 o'clock, he was in the back of a police carriage, escorted toward the station. Violet stood beside Miss Marple in the dark garden, wind stirring her hair, her hands no longer trembling. "I never thought I'd be free of him." Miss Marple didn't smile. "You're not free yet," she said gently, "but you've begun the walk toward it." She looked up at the stars, faint and soft behind the retreating clouds. And even ghosts eventually fade when the story is told. Chapter 10. Miss Marple reflects a week passed in Haycroft Hill, and with it the mists receded and the garden beds woke into full bloom. The village, never one to dwell too long on darkness, began to restore its rhythms. Sunday bells, clean, laundry on lines and polite chatter at the greengrocer's, slightly lowered when Miss Marple passed. Matthew Felton remained in custody, though formal charges had yet to be filed regarding the fire in Eastbourne. New evidence was being quietly assembled. Inspector Cray, now in possession of Violet's diary page, Felton's false identity papers, and Clara Linton's reluctant admission about the note she passed, had more than enough to keep the man from vanishing a second time. Violet Barton, for her part, did not leave the village. Not yet. At Miss Marple's suggestion, she took a position assisting Mrs. Morley at the vicarage, and spent her days arranging hymnals, trimming flower stems, and slowly reclaiming the sound of her own voice. The morning after Felton's departure, she and Miss Marple sat in the latter's garden under a flowering lilac tree, a pot of tea between them, and birdsong lilting through the hedge. "Do you think I'll ever stop looking over my shoulder?" Violet asked. "Miss Marple, who was threading a fresh needle into her sampler, didn't answer at once. "No," she said quietly. "But one day you'll find you no longer expect to see him when you do." Violet nodded. "And what about the others? Mrs. Grenfell, Miss Linton?" "Ah," said Miss Marple, "they have their own reckonings. Georgina Grenfell will live with what she protected. Not out of guilt, I think, but something more dangerous. Pride. And Clara Linton. She simply did what she's always done. Passed along information without caring where it landed. She'll feel just enough shame to keep quiet for a while." Giselle smiled faintly. "I thought people like you only existed in stories." "Oh, no," said Miss Marple, lifting her cup. "We exist. We just don't usually make much noise." Later that day, Inspector Cray arrived for one final conversation. He sat across from Miss Marple with his notebook open, but the page was blank. "I still don't quite understand how you figured it all out." Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea. "It began," she said, "with a scream." Cray chuckled. "Not exactly subtle." "No," she agreed, "but it wasn't meant to be. Violet wasn't frightened of an accident. She was frightened of a memory. And that's a very specific kind of fear." She stirred her tea gently. Then there was the footprint at the garden edge. Too heavy for a villager, too precise for a passer-by, and the missing spoon, which had been pulled from her tray, not dropped. A moment of recognition, you see. Violet saw him, and in that moment he tried to stop her scream. Cray nodded. "And the tool shed. Once I saw the burned satchel, the old name and the forged papers. It all fit. The man from the fire in Eastbourne had never died. He simply reappeared under another name, assuming the one person who could connect him to the past had been silenced by fear." Miss Marple's voice dropped slightly. "But fear, Inspector, is not the same as silence, not forever." In the days that followed, Haycroft Hill eased back into itself. The scandal began to fray at the edges, replaced by talk of the upcoming fete, a new arrival at the manse, and whether or not Lady Eastcliffe's roses were truly as rare as she claimed. Miss Marple, alone again in her drawing-room, tucked away her notes, the diary page, the typewritten threat, the photograph of a younger Matthew Felton, unearthed from a registrar's archive, all sealed in a brown envelope, tied with string, labelled Celia Pike. Violet Barton resolved. She placed it in a drawer alongside other envelopes with names long forgotten by the village. Names that had once held fear, doubt and mystery, but now only paper and ink. Then she returned to her armchair, her needlepoint still unfinished, and began a new row of stitching. Beneath the words she'd started months before. "Evil begins when good people look away." She paused, glanced out the window at the calm street below, and smiled. Not this time.